afternoon sun dipped below the treetops of Whispering Pines, Oregon, casting golden streaks across the backyard of the Halpern residence. It was a peaceful town, one of those postcard-perfect places where neighbors still waved from porches and kids rode bikes until the street lights flickered on. The Halperns were new to the area, having moved from Portland just 2 months earlier. Mark Halpern, a former Marine-turned-mechanic, wanted something quieter for his wife Linda and their only child, Summer. 6-year-old Summer Halpern was a curious soul, always asking questions, always twirling through the grass in bare feet, and always getting lost in her own make-believe worlds. That day had been particularly warm, and after dinner, she begged her parents for just 10 more minutes outside to play. Linda, rinsing dishes in the kitchen sink, had smiled and agreed with a warning, but only in the yard, and stay where we can see you. Summer had nodded, her coppery hair bouncing as she darted out the back door with the kind of glee only a child could summon. She had recently become obsessed with hide and seek. Every afternoon, she'd ask her mom or dad to play. That evening, with dusk settling and cicadas humming in the distance, she decided to surprise them. Instead of asking to play, she would just disappear and wait for them to find her. It was her little game, a secret version of hide and seek, where she wouldn't tell them she was hiding. That, to her 6-year-old mind, made it more exciting. The yard was large, bordered by tall pines and a crumbling wooden fence. At the far end stood a small cabin-like structure that came with the property. It had once been a tool shed, then a chicken coop, and more recently just a neglected shack with flaking white paint and a door that groaned on rusty hinges. Mark had planned to tear it down, but never got around to it. Summer loved the place. She called it her fairy house, and often imagined little creatures lived inside the cracks in the walls. She tiptoed to the back of the yard, clutching her pink stuffed bunny, and slipped into the shadow of the old shed. The door creaked open, and she giggled softly as it closed behind her. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight filtering through the slats. Inside, it smelled of earth, old wood, and something faintly sweet. Summer crouched behind a toppled chair and waited. In the kitchen, Linda glanced at the clock. 10 minutes had passed. She dried her hands and called out the back door. "Summer, time's up." No answer. She stepped out onto the porch, frowning. "Summer." Still nothing. She scanned the yard, noting the fading light, and called again, louder this time. "Honey." Mark was in the garage, sorting through boxes of old tools. When he heard Linda's tone shift from casual to worried, he dropped the wrench and came out. "She's not answering," Linda said, her voice tight. "I told her to stay in the yard." They began searching, first with mild concern, then with mounting panic. They checked under the porch, behind the trees, around the shed. Mark even peeked into the neighbor's yard through a gap in the fence. No Summer. "She wouldn't have left," Linda whispered, more to herself than to him. "Check the house," Mark said quickly, already jogging back through the yard. Linda ran inside, calling Summer's name up the staircase, throwing open closets, checking the bathroom, the laundry room, under the beds. Nothing. 10 more minutes passed. Mark grabbed a flashlight and returned to the shed. He opened the door wide, shining the beam across the interior. Empty. Just dust, old shelves, and scraps of metal. He walked in, knocking on the walls, even crouching to look beneath the floorboards. Nothing. By 7:45 p.m., they had called 911. Within the hour, deputies arrived from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Flashlights swept through the trees. Dogs were brought in. Neighbors joined the search. A helicopter buzzed overhead with a spotlight carving arcs into the dark forest. But there was no sign of Summer Halpern. It was like she had evaporated from the yard. No footprints. No broken twigs. No sounds. No leads. The next morning, The town woke up to news that would haunt it for years. 6-year-old girl vanishes from backyard. Mark Halpern stood motionless at the edge of the yard, the once familiar contours of his property now twisted into something hollow, empty, alien. It had been 5 days since Summer vanished, and still, every morning he found himself rising before dawn, mechanically retracing steps he'd already walked 100 times. He'd search the porch again, the shed again, the crawl space, the treetops, the fence line, anywhere. His hands were blistered from pulling up boards, prying loose rocks, digging through wet earth beneath the swing set. But there was no sign of her. Nothing. Just silence and his own echoing guilt. The community's concern slowly morphed into murmured doubts. They asked questions with too much care, as if trying not to disturb something unstable. You were home at the time, right? She was just playing in the yard. You didn't hear anything unusual? Mark answered the same questions again and again, but he could feel the shift. People stopped meeting his eyes. Some avoided walking their dogs past his driveway. Others gave sympathetic smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. The sheriff had called him in twice already. Not formally. Not yet. Just to talk, they'd said. But Mark knew the script. He'd seen it in the Corps. When someone disappears, you start close. Real close. Mark's service in Afghanistan had ended nearly a decade earlier, but the aftershocks of that deployment never left. He had a documented history of nightmares, mood swings, and unpredictable anger. Linda had stood by him through most of it, until now. During the second police interview, the sheriff brought up an incident from 6 years ago. A noise complaint. A neighbor said they heard shouting late at night. Mark had punched a wall. Summer was a baby then. Nothing came of it. But now, with Summer missing and no evidence of foul play or forced entry, old files like that suddenly mattered again. Mark saw it in the way Deputy Wallace watched him, pen tapping slowly against the table. Do you remember what you were doing at exactly 6:30 p.m. last Thursday? The deputy asked. Fixing the garage door, Mark had said. The spring had snapped. I was working on it while Linda made dinner. The deputy's pen froze. You were alone out there? Mark nodded. Linda was inside. Summer was out back. Wallace closed his notebook gently and stood. We'll be in touch. Back home, Linda had grown thinner. Her face seemed perpetually shadowed, not just by the lack of sleep, but by something darker. She barely spoke, only moved through the house like a ghost. Her fingers shook when she brewed coffee, but she never drank it. The room still smelled faintly of lavender shampoo and peanut butter toast, Summer's favorites. Her daughter's drawings remained taped to the fridge, wilting under their own weight. Each day that passed carved deeper into her. On the 30th day, Linda sat on the bathroom floor in her nightgown, the shower running cold, staring at the drain as if it held answers. Mark found her there. He wrapped her in a towel, carried her to bed, and said nothing. She didn't cry. The next morning, she left a note on the kitchen counter. I'm going to my sister's in Spokane. I can't breathe here. The handwriting was jagged, uneven. She was gone before he woke up. Mark called her twice, then stopped. She didn't answer, and he didn't blame her. A year passed. The yard grew wild. The town slowly moved on. The sheriff's visit stopped. No leads. No tips. No sightings. Just a file that grew thicker with time. Mark stopped working. He drank more than he should have, often falling asleep on the porch, wrapped in one of Summer's old blankets. His beard grew out. He talked to himself. And the neighbors whispered. In the mailbox, there were envelopes from realtors, notices from the bank, a letter from the VA about mental health services. He burned them all in the rusted fire pit by the shed. And yet, every evening at 6:30, he walked to the far end of the yard and opened the old wooden shed, even though he knew it was empty. Just for a moment, he'd stand there and listen, as if some echo of her laughter might come back. Then one day, a new face knocked on the door. A private investigator hired by a distant cousin of Linda's. The woman was young, persistent, and had a voice that never softened. "Did you notice any strange activity around the time of Summer's disappearance?" she asked. Mark answered honestly. No strangers. No vehicles. No noises. Just the usual silence. But when she brought up his military past, he stiffened. "You think I hurt my kid?" he asked, voice cold. "I think we need to rule everything out," she said. "You have a history of violence, Mr. Halpern." Mark stood and left the room. He didn't slam the door, just closed it gently behind him. That night, he walked deeper into the woods than he ever had before, a flashlight in one hand, a hammer in the other, calling Summer's name. Not because he thought he'd find her, but because no one else was calling anymore. Meanwhile, in a town 400 miles north, a pale woman with streaks of gray in her hair sat on the floor of a rented apartment. Surrounded by boxes she refused to unpack. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. The calendar on the wall still read August, though it was October. She had stopped flipping it months ago. On the kitchen counter sat a framed photo of a red-haired girl holding a stuffed bunny, eyes bright with mischief. Linda stared at it for hours that day, her mind drifting, replaying the sound of her daughter's giggle echoing from somewhere out of reach. And then one night, in a dream, or maybe a memory, she saw the shed again. The door open, something shifting in the shadows. A whisper, faint and impossible. It said her name, not Mom, just Linda. 14 years had passed since the day Summer Halpern vanished, and the house at the end of Pine Needle Lane had become something of a local myth. The Halperns had long since moved away. Mark eventually disappeared entirely, last seen hitching southbound from a gas station outside Bend, and Linda had remarried in northern Idaho, never once setting foot back in Whispering Pines. The house had remained mostly abandoned, passing through 3 banks and 2 property managers, none of whom could sell it. Something about it felt heavy, like the walls held onto sorrow. The backyard in particular was avoided, especially by children. Neighborhood stories had formed, whispered dares passed between teens on bikes. The shed was haunted or cursed or worse. But none of those stories reached Frank Murdoch. He was a retired electrician who had bought the property for dirt cheap, thinking he could flip it or tear it down. He didn't believe in ghosts or superstition. Frank just wanted something to keep his hands busy, and the place had good bones, even if it needed a gut job. He spent most of his mornings walking his golden retriever, Millie, through the side path behind the house, and every afternoon hammering, replacing old windows, and cleaning out the garage. He saved the shed for last. It was rotting at the corners and leaned like it had grown tired of standing. Frank figured he'd pull it down in one weekend and build a new workshop in its place. That's how it started. One warm Saturday in July, under a clear blue sky, Frank emptied the shed of its debris, busted rakes, rusted oil cans, a broken stool. He noticed the floorboards were loose and uneven, but he assumed it was just age. Then Millie started growling. It was low, steady, and unusual for her. She stood at the door, staring inside, ears pulled back. Frank laughed it off at first, tossing her a treat and telling her to relax. But something about her stillness unsettled him. When he stepped back inside and knelt to inspect the warped planks, the smell hit him. Not strong, not fresh, but ancient, stale rot, like wet books and mildew, buried too long. He pried up one of the boards with a crowbar, expecting maybe mold or old insulation. Instead, he found a hole, a shallow cavity beneath the shed. It wasn't natural. The edges were lined with hand-cut boards, as if someone had built a crawlspace deliberately. Frank pulled away more flooring, working carefully. The more he removed, the deeper the cavity seemed to go. It wasn't big enough for an adult to stand upright, but large enough to crawl through. He fetched his flashlight and aimed the beam into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but dirt and shadow. Then something caught the light, pink, bright pink. He reached down and retrieved a small object covered in dust. It was a shoe, a child's sneaker. The fabric was faded and stiff, but the brand tag was still visible. It was a model from 2009. Frank stared at it for a long moment, his breath shallow. He remembered the rumors, of course. The missing girl, the searches, the parents who never came back. Everyone in Whispering Pines had heard of the Halpern case. But this was real. He set the shoe aside gently and shined the light further. There was something else. A small plastic folder, cracked and water-damaged. Inside were wrinkled pages, sketches, mostly. Crayon drawings of houses, flowers, faces with large eyes. Some pages were torn. Others were warped beyond legibility. But one, in particular, made his stomach turn. It was a drawing of a girl holding a stuffed bunny, standing next to a small white house with crooked windows. Above it, written in a child's unsteady scrawl, were the words, "My house is quiet. My house is dark. I'm waiting." Frank sat back on his heels, the air thick with disbelief. This was evidence. Real evidence. Something that had been here, hidden, for over a decade. He stepped out of the shed, heart pounding, and dialed the sheriff's office. It took less than 30 minutes for 2 patrol cars to arrive. Deputies roped off the area. A forensic team followed. They took photos, collected samples, and eventually brought in ground-penetrating radar. The space beneath the shed was examined thoroughly, revealing what investigators later described as an intentional enclosure constructed sometime in the early 2000s. No human remains were found. No DNA yet confirmed. But the shoe and notebook were enough to reopen the case. News vans returned to Pine Needle Lane for the first time in years. The town buzzed again, not with excitement, but with that uncomfortable thrill that came when tragedy resurfaced. Linda was contacted, her voice cracking when she heard the words, "We found something." She flew down 2 days later, arriving alone. She stood outside the shed, hands clenched, and didn't speak for a long time. When they showed her the drawings, she only nodded once. "Summer drew that bunny," she said. She called it Rosie. The notebook was sent to a lab for moisture analysis, and the cavity beneath the shed was sealed again pending further excavation. But something else emerged too, something unexplainable. One of the deputies, while reviewing motion sensor footage from the previous week, noticed something odd. Just before dawn on the day Frank found the shoe, the outdoor camera, mounted near the back fence, captured a faint flicker of movement near the shed. A shadow, fleeting, low to the ground. It disappeared within seconds, but the timestamp was exact. The footage was too grainy to identify anything. Some said it was a raccoon. Others weren't so sure. Frank, for his part, said nothing publicly. But when asked by reporters if he believed in ghosts now, he only looked away and said, "I believe someone was still trying to be found." The investigation turned up one last item, a rusted metal plate buried beneath the far end of the crawl space, etched with initials no one recognized, and beneath it, as news of the discovery beneath the shed spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire, old memories, some buried, some never quite forgotten, began to surface. Among the older residents of the town, there were those who exchanged wary glances rather than words, as if the past was knocking at the front door again, unwelcome and relentless. At the Pine County Historical Society, a part-time archivist named Clara Welk took a particular interest in the Halpern property after seeing a local news piece about the reopened case. She was 63, meticulous, and fond of stories that nobody wanted to remember. It wasn't long before she pulled out a dusty file labeled simply Pine Needle A 1956. Inside were faded photographs, clippings from yellowed newspapers, and a brittle fire inspection report. What caught her eye was a front-page headline from August of that year: "Boy Missing After Mysterious House Fire." The article detailed how a small home on the very lot where the Halperns later lived had caught fire under unclear circumstances. It belonged to the Merton family, who had a 7-year-old son named Clyde. According to the report, both parents had survived with minor injuries, but Clyde had not been found in the wreckage. No body was ever recovered. Investigators at the time believed the boy had either run from the flames into the nearby woods or had been abducted amid the chaos. The case, like Summers, remained unsolved. What Clara found strange was the address. It matched the Halperns exactly. The house Summer disappeared from had been built on the ashes of a forgotten tragedy. That night, Clara made several calls. One of them was to her older cousin Gary, who had been a teen in the 50s and remembered the fire vividly. "I was 13, Gary said, his voice gravelly through the receiver. "We saw smoke from the schoolyard. When we got there, the roof had already caved in. I remember the mother screaming for Clyde. Said he never made it out of his room. They searched for weeks. Found nothing. People started saying the fire was no accident." Clara pressed him for more, but he grew evasive. "Some things are better left alone, Clara." The following morning, Clara visited the sheriff's office and handed over the file, insisting it be added to the Halpern investigation. That same week, another person came forward, an old plumber named Bill Horner, who had worked on the house in the early 1990s, long before the Halperns ever moved in. Bill was known in town as a bit of a rambler, often found nursing coffee at the diner, telling stories about faulty piping and basement crawl spaces. But when he heard about the shoe and the notebook, something clicked. He told Deputy Wallace that back in '93, he'd been called to fix a frozen pipe near the back wall of the shed. While crawling under the structure, he noticed what looked like a false panel in the foundation. Rough wood, out of place with the rest of the concrete. Intrigued, he mentioned it to the homeowner at the time, a Mr. Alden Griffith, a reclusive man who had inherited the house from his father. Griffith had reacted strangely, Bill remembered. His demeanor had shifted from polite to stern in an instant. "That area's sealed for a reason," Griffith had said, almost hissing. "Don't touch it again." Bill hadn't argued. He'd seen enough weirdness in old houses to know when to back off. But now, putting it all together, he realized that whatever lay beneath the shed hadn't just been there since the Halperns moved in. It had likely existed for decades, untouched, unspoken, and hidden behind generations of silence. When police searched through county permits and building records, they confirmed the timeline. The current shed had indeed been built in 1961, 5 years after the fire. No official blueprints mentioned the crawl space or the added paneling. It was constructed off-record, likely by someone who didn't want their modifications known. It raised more questions than it answered. Who built the cavity? Was it related to Clyde Merton's disappearance? Could two missing children, nearly 60 years apart, really be connected by geography and architecture alone? Linda, now staying at a nearby inn, spent her days sitting in the sheriff's archive room, poring over photos of the Merton house and its smoldering ruins. In one grainy image, she saw something that stopped her breath. In the center of the photo, just past the skeleton of a scorched window frame, stood a narrow wooden wardrobe, blackened, but intact. It was tall, with a curved top and carved panels. It was the same shape as the old armoire that had stood in Summer's room, a family heirloom that had come with the house and which she had insisted never be moved, even when they'd replaced her bed. Linda remembered how summer used to open and close its creaky doors for fun, pretending it was a portal to another world. One day she'd even said, "There's a tiny hole in the back. I think it leads somewhere." Linda had thought it was a child's fantasy, a Narnia-inspired game. But now, with the image in front of her, that sentence echoed louder than ever. She traced the edge of the photo with her finger. "I need to see that armoire," she whispered. The problem was, no one knew where it had gone. It hadn't been included in the inventory when the Halperns moved out. The bank had stored some items, auctioned others. Records were spotty. Some pieces had been claimed by a distant relative of Mark's. Others were lost. That night, Linda sat alone in the dim light of her motel room, staring at a hand-drawn map of the house's original layout. She circled the spot where Summer's room had been, then the shed, then the area of the fire from 1956. Every mark pointed to the same corner of the property. One place, one shadow. After the rediscovery of the house's grim history and the eerie coincidence involving the armoire and the missing Merton boy from 1956, Deputy Wallace made the decision to place motion-activated surveillance equipment around the property. It wasn't standard protocol, but he justified it under the guise of monitoring for vandalism, given the surge in curiosity and foot traffic since the story had gone public again. Privately, he didn't know what he expected to find, but he couldn't shake the sensation that the Halpern lot wasn't just a scene of past tragedies. It was alive in some way, watching, waiting. 2 thermal cameras were installed at opposite corners of the shed, each fitted with night vision. A third, more sensitive motion-triggered camera was placed inside the structure itself, facing the rear wall. The team also installed an audio recorder calibrated to detect subtle, high-frequency sounds like whispering or crying. They left the equipment running uninterrupted for 7 nights. Nothing unusual happened during the first 2. On the 3rd night, a raccoon scurried across the frame. On the 4th, a passing deer lingered near the edge of the frame before darting off. But in the early hours of the 6th night, something different occurred. At precisely 3:08 a.m., the inside camera activated. The footage showed the empty interior of the shed, dimly illuminated by infrared. For 10 full seconds, nothing moved. Then, just as the system was about to time out, the microphone picked up something, a faint, high-pitched giggle. It was unmistakably a child's laugh, soft but clear, echoing through the wooden frame. The system triggered again at 3:09 a.m. This time, the laugh was louder, accompanied by a creaking sound like floorboards shifting under weight. Then silence. The sheriff's department reviewed the audio dozens of times. Some officers dismissed it as glitch-induced feedback. Others weren't so quick to rationalize. The sound technician noted the laugh had tonal characteristics consistent with a 6 to 7-year-old female child, based on frequency range and vocal pitch. The following night, a member of the forensics team volunteered to monitor the live feed from the shed in real time. Her name was Maya Lewis, a recent transfer from Portland with a background in audio analytics. She had an analytical mind, but also a quiet belief that not everything could be explained by science alone. That night, as she sat in the surveillance van parked across the street, she heard the sound live through her headphones. It wasn't just a laugh this time, it was humming. A child's voice, off-key and halting, reciting something that sounded like a nursery rhyme. Maya quickly hit record, time-stamped the file, and leaned closer to the monitor. The camera flickered once. Then, for the briefest of moments, it captured something near the rear wall of the shed. A flicker of movement. A blur. Then it was gone. She played it back frame by frame. There, between seconds 6 and 7, the shape appeared. A flash of color against the grayscale night vision, distorted but undeniably present. The outline resembled a small figure crouched in the corner. Most chilling was the fabric, a patch of red, torn, faded, but still vivid. Maya froze. The Halperns had stated that Summer had been wearing a red dress the day she vanished. They had described it in detail, a handmade cotton dress with little white flowers along the hem. The patch caught on the camera looked like the same material. Maya didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she brought the footage to Wallace, who watched it several times without saying a word. Then he stood abruptly and walked out. Linda Halpern was brought in to view the clip in a control room. She listened to the laugh, the humming, and then saw the red flicker. Her hand went to her mouth, eyes wide with a terror that had never fully left. "That's her dress," she whispered. "She used to hum when she was alone. That exact tune. It was from a music box she had." The audio was analyzed again, this time by a private firm that specialized in paranormal investigations. They enhanced the sound and tried to separate the background noise. What they uncovered wasn't comforting. Underneath the child's voice, there was another sound, quieter, deeper, rhythmic, like breathing, but not human breathing. Mechanical, steady, as if recorded from inside a small, enclosed space. The implications were too chilling to ignore. It suggested that someone or something was inside the walls when the child's voice was captured. The shed was searched again, this time with cadaver dogs and specialized thermal scanners. Nothing living was found. No passageways, no hatches, no evidence of recent human occupation. Yet the camera continued to record anomalies, whispers, creaks, sudden drops in temperature. At one point, the interior light sensor dropped to 0, as if someone had covered the lens with their hand. But no one was inside. The footage grew more erratic. On the 8th night, the camera caught a brief burst of static at 3:03 a.m., followed by a single whispered word, "Linda." The voice was faint, trembling, barely discernible. But when Maya isolated the clip and ran a vocal match, the result was jarring. It matched the voice of Summer Halpern from a birthday video recorded 3 months before her disappearance. Linda collapsed when she heard it. "She's alive," she said through sobs. Or was. She began asking questions the sheriff couldn't answer. What if she was trapped down there all this time? What if someone kept her hidden, under us? Investigators now faced a difficult choice. With no physical evidence of a living presence, they couldn't justify tearing down the structure completely. But the psychological weight of what they had captured, the sound, the shadow, the color, was enough to fracture even the most skeptical among them. Still, there was one piece missing, one last place no one had yet thought to look. Maya remembered the technician's early remark that the breathing sounded like it came from inside something small. She returned to the shed alone one afternoon, flashlight in hand, kneeling beside the armoire that had since been moved there by the recovery team. She ran her hands along the back panel, knocking gently. On the 3rd knock, the hollow thud changed. The knock rang hollow and deep, different from the solid wood around it. Maya froze, her fingers splayed across the back panel of the armoire that now stood against the interior wall of the shed, temporarily relocated there during the investigation for lack of a better place. Her heart pounded as she pressed her ear to the panel. She knocked again, softer this time, and heard the same dull echo, a resonance of empty space. She reached into her satchel, retrieved a pocket multi-tool, and began to work along the seam, prying gently at the panel's edge. It took several tries and one bruised knuckle, but eventually the old wood gave way, revealing a narrow vertical shaft behind it. Dust billowed into the air, coating her face and clothing, but she didn't care. Her flashlight barely pierced the darkness within, but the faint outline of something metallic shimmered faintly at the bottom. A ladder, fixed to the wall, leading downward. She backed away slowly and called Deputy Wallace immediately. Within the hour, a full team was on site. The shed was evacuated and secured, with law enforcement, a structural engineer, and a small team from forensics descending cautiously into the shaft. It dropped about 12 feet into a narrow stone corridor, the walls cramped and lined with makeshift wooden reinforcement, old and damp. The air was stale, like a cellar that had never breathed fresh oxygen. Maya followed close behind, her voice recorded for documentation, noting each step, each turn. The tunnel continued for 20 feet, curving beneath the eastern part of the property, until it opened into a small chamber roughly 10 feet by 10. The room was entirely encased in brick, with a ceiling no higher than 6 feet, and at first glance, it looked like some kind of Cold War fallout shelter. But the details didn't fit. The corners were too rounded, the floor too uneven. This wasn't a bunker built by the government. It was hand-dug, custom-made, and every inch of it was deliberate. The first thing they noticed was the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, almost dense, as if sound itself didn't want to linger in the space. Then the light fell on the far wall, and everyone froze. There, in jagged lines, etched across the bricks in crude red wax, were markings. Not just one or two, hundreds. Childlike scribbles layered upon each other, overlapping and dense. There were faces with wide, empty eyes, flowers with thorns, a door with no knob. And in the very center of the chaos, over and over again, the same sentence written in small, uneven letters: "Mommy will find me." The words appeared in clusters, sometimes spelled correctly, sometimes not, but always in red crayon, always written low to the ground, as if by a small child sitting on her knees. A few investigators had to step out of the chamber to compose themselves. Linda, upon being shown the room, wept silently, her hands trembling as she traced one of the sentences with her fingertip. "She wrote this," she whispered. "I know her hand. She used to flip her wise backward." The team collected samples from the walls, the dirt floor, and even the ceiling. There were small remnants of bedding, blankets, torn fabric, and beneath a pile of debris, an old plastic lunchbox with a sticker still clinging to one corner. A faded cartoon princess. Inside it were a few dried-out markers, a plastic spoon, and what appeared to be a crumpled piece of a photograph, Summer's school portrait from first grade, torn down the middle. The discovery changed everything. This wasn't just an urban legend anymore. The evidence was undeniable. A child had lived here, or at least spent a significant amount of time here. There was no plumbing, no ventilation, no access to food or water. The place was a tomb, dressed like a nursery. A forensic artist was brought in to examine the writing, confirming that based on stroke analysis and spacing, it had likely been produced by the same hand over a long period of time, perhaps months, even years. Someone had kept Summer here. Someone had built this room deliberately and had gone to great lengths to conceal it. But who? The records on the property's history grew murkier the deeper they looked. Ownership between the years 1958 and 1970 had passed through several hands, including private trusts and shell entities. One name, however, came up more than once: Alden Griffith, the same man who had warned the plumber not to touch the hidden panel years ago. Further investigation into Griffith's family revealed that his father, Everett Griffith, had been the original owner of the land. Everett, a retired architect with no known spouse or children until his late 40s, had designed dozens of homes in Oregon and had a penchant for building hidden compartments, secret passageways, and underground storage spaces. Local archives showed that he died under suspicious circumstances in 1982, an apparent fall from his own attic, though no foul play was determined. And yet, whispered stories from the time told of a strange man who kept to himself, rarely allowed anyone into his home, and had once been seen dragging large crates into the woods behind the property late at night. Those who remembered him used words like eccentric, paranoid, and off. Maya began to piece together a chilling hypothesis. What if the original room had been constructed decades before Summer was even born? What if it had been used before? What if Clyde Merton, the boy who disappeared in the fire of 1956, had been its first occupant? The notion was horrifying but impossible to ignore. 2 children, 50 years apart, both vanished without a trace from the same piece of land. Both tied to a hidden room no one was supposed to find. And etched into the walls by the second child, Summer Halpern, a message that defied time and reason. "Mommy will find me," repeated like a prayer or a spell. The team installed additional sensors in the tunnel and chamber, hoping for further evidence. But something had changed. The space was colder now, still, as if whatever had lived there or died there had finally grown quiet. Then, 2 nights later, Maya received a call from one of the junior deputies who had been monitoring the new camera feeds from the crawlspace. "You need to see this," he said, his voice unsteady. "It recorded something at 2:37 a.m. You're not going to believe what it caught crawling out from behind the far wall." 3 days after the footage from the crawlspace was captured, Maya returned to the shed with a printout of the grainy black and white image extracted from the 2:37 a.m. video. It showed a blurry form crawling out from the narrow space behind the far wall of the underground chamber. The movement low and methodical, almost serpentine. The figure size and posture were consistent with a small human, but the resolution was too poor to confirm details. The footage, though brief, sent a ripple of unease through everyone who reviewed it, a feeling that something had survived down there, or had perhaps never truly left. Maya filed the footage into the official case report and tried to move forward with the investigation. But just as things seemed to be gaining clarity, a new, inexplicable event threw everything into chaos. On a Monday morning, just after sunrise, Linda Halpern arrived at the sheriff's office with an envelope in her hand, her face pale, her fingers shaking. She said she had found a slid under her motel room door. There was no return address, no note, only a single folded photograph printed in infrared tones. It depicted a figure, female, slender, standing half hidden among trees, her body barely visible in the thermal overlay. But what struck Linda was the shape of the face, the curve of the cheekbones, and most of all, the long, unkempt hair spilling over her shoulders. It was her, or rather, it was Summer. She knew that shape, those eyes, the slope of that nose. It was her daughter, or someone who looked exactly like her, alive and moving somewhere in the woods. The sheriff initially dismissed it as a cruel prank, possibly inspired by the publicity around the crawlspace discovery, but Linda would not be deterred. She insisted that the photo be analyzed, and Maya agreed. They traced the source of the thermal image to a type of motion-activated camera used primarily by wildlife researchers. Maya contacted a local biologist who confirmed that he had lost a unit in the Deschutes National Forest some months prior, about 80 miles northeast of Whispering Pines. The coordinates listed on the image data matched the area precisely. A search team was dispatched immediately. It was a massive expanse of wilderness, rugged and unyielding, but they began combing through the area section by section. On the 4th day, near dusk, 2 rangers found her. She was curled up beneath a pine tree, wrapped in a shredded sleeping bag, her face smeared with dirt and her lips cracked from dehydration. Her hair was tangled and matted, and she flinched at every sound. When they approached, she didn't speak, just stared with wide, dark eyes, too exhausted or frightened to run. She looked about 20, though the elements made it hard to guess precisely. She wore a gray hoodie several sizes too big and a pair of torn canvas shoes with no laces. She had no ID, no wallet, no name. When asked for it, she blinked, opened her mouth, and said nothing. At the hospital, she remained silent for the first 36 hours. They gave her fluids, cleaned her up, and took a full physical. Aside from malnutrition and minor bruising, she was surprisingly healthy. The psychologist who examined her believed she might be suffering from dissociative amnesia, a trauma-induced mental break that blocked her memories. They collected her DNA as part of standard protocol for missing persons. Maya was in the sheriff's office when the results came back. The technician stared at the screen for a long time before calling Maya over. The report confirmed a near-perfect maternal match. The girl in the woods was Summer Halpern. 14 years after her disappearance, the child who had vanished into thin air from a backyard game of hide-and-seek was alive. Linda collapsed when she saw her. The reunion was surreal, heartbreaking, incomplete. Summer didn't recognize her mother. She flinched at physical contact and refused to speak more than a few words at a time. The psychologist warned them that it might take weeks, months, or even years for her full memories to return, if they ever did. Linda stayed by her side at the hospital, holding her hand gently, brushing her hair with the same brush from her childhood, reading from books they used to share. Slowly, Summer began responding, short nods, faint smiles, one or two whispered answers to simple questions. But there was something else. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., Summer would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, eyes wide with terror. She never remembered the dreams. When asked, she'd just mutter, "The wall. The dark wall." On the 7th night, Linda found her in the hospital room, crouched under the bed, humming the same broken tune from the surveillance footage. She kept tracing invisible symbols on the underside of the mattress, over and over again. The same curve, the same shapes. Maya brought a notepad and asked her to draw them. When Summer finished, Maya compared them to the markings from the underground chamber. They were identical. Every symbol matched. Summer had lived there, had survived there, somehow. And yet, questions multiplied. How did she get out? Who fed her? Where had she been for the past decade? And more importantly, why did she keep looking over her shoulder, as if someone was still watching? In the days following the DNA confirmation, a delicate balance settled over the hospital room where Summer Halpern now stayed under 24-hour observation. Though she was physically healing, her mind remained partially locked away, like a book sealed by trauma and time. She spoke in fragments, rarely initiating conversation, but every now and then she let something slip, tiny glimpses of the years that had vanished from her life. One evening, as Linda was brushing her daughter's hair in silence, Summer whispered, "He used to bring apples, sometimes peanut butter sandwiches." Linda froze, gently lowering the brush. "Who, baby?" Summer's eyes didn't move. She stared at the wall, blinking slowly. "The man. The one who said it wasn't safe outside. That if I left, I'd disappear forever like the others." Her voice dropped the end, almost inaudible. Linda tried to steady her own breathing. "Do you remember his name?" Summer shook her head, slightly. "He had a smell, like paint and old books." That description struck something in Maya, who had been reviewing files from early search interviews. The Halperns' immediate neighbor, Thomas Rayner, had once been questioned but not formally investigated. He was an older man, lived alone, had a history as a retired school librarian and part-time carpenter. He'd also been Mark Halpern's friend for over a decade before the disappearance. Rayner had helped install the shed's new lock after Summer vanished. At the time, no one thought twice. After all, he'd shown up to search parties and offered his tools to assist law enforcement. But now, with Summer's vague yet specific recollections resurfacing, he became more than a footnote. Wallace issued a summons for Rayner to appear for formal questioning. When officers arrived at his house, they found him sitting on the front porch, sipping tea, as if he'd been expecting them. "She's alive then," he said before anyone spoke. "I suppose it was only a matter of time." The statement was recorded and submitted as part of the report, though Rayner refused to elaborate further, citing fatigue and requesting a delay until the following day. Officers noted his frailty. He had lost considerable weight since the initial investigation, his skin pale and eyes sunken. Still, he didn't seem confused or disoriented. He just seemed done. That night, Thomas Rayner was found dead in his armchair, a half-empty mug beside him and an unlabeled pill bottle on the floor. The coroner would later confirm it was a suicide, overdose of sedatives mixed with alcohol. There was no note, no confession, only silence. But inside his basement workshop, officers discovered a series of unsettling clues. Behind a false panel in his back wall were several plastic storage bins containing journals, maps of the neighborhood, and old photos. One of the photos was of the Halpern backyard before the shed was repaired, highlighted with red ink, circling what appeared to be a portion of the ground where the entrance to the hidden room was later discovered. Another bin contained children's books, several of which had Summer's name inscribed in the corner. One, The Secret Garden, was marked with the words property of Summer H. Inside its cover was a faded sticker that read, "Keep quiet equals stay safe." The investigators pieced together a grim theory. Rayner had known about the hidden chamber. Whether he built it himself or simply maintained it was unclear, but it was almost certain he had visited it over the years. Summer's statements began to align. Someone had fed her, left books, clothes, and even attempted rudimentary education materials. He hadn't abused her, at least not physically, but he had imprisoned her under the guise of protection. He said monsters lived outside, she told her therapist during a recorded session. He said they wore smiles but had knives for teeth. The psychological manipulation ran deep. Rayner had likely convinced her that leaving meant death, that he was her only protector. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he didn't. Either way, he had kept her hidden for years while the world searched just feet above her. When the news of his death broke, the town reacted with a cocktail of shock and quiet shame. Rayner had tutored dozens of children, repaired bikes for free, hosted story time at the library. He was part of the community's fabric. And yet, behind closed doors, he had hoarded a secret that unraveled a family and nearly destroyed a child. Maya spent hours combing through his journals, searching for names, dates, anything pointing to accomplices or more victims. One entry from 2009 stood out. It read simply, "She arrived today. Smaller than I thought. Quiet. Afraid. But she'll learn to understand. This is for her safety. The world outside would eat her alive." That same journal had another note scribbled along the edge of a page, one that made Maya's stomach turn. Clyde didn't listen. Summer will. The connection to Clyde Merton, the boy from 1956 who vanished after the fire, suddenly became more than coincidence. What if Rayner had been involved even then, as a boy or young man? What if this was generational? A legacy of secrecy and control passed down through whispers and warped beliefs. Linda, upon learning of Rayner's death, felt no closure, only a deeper hole where justice might have gone. "He took her life," she said, standing in the yard that once held the shed. "He didn't kill her, but he took everything else." Summer didn't react when she was told the man who held her was gone. She sat quietly, drawing in a notebook, pressing hard on the page until the crayon broke. Her drawing depicted a door with no handle and a girl standing in front of it, her face blank, her arms outstretched. Above the door were red letters, "Still here." The nightmares returned in sharp, violent waves, each one clawing deeper into Summer's fragile recovery. Every night around 3, she would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, fists clenched, voice caught in her throat. The hospital staff noted the consistency of the timing and tried administering mild sedatives. But even then, the dreams clawed their way through the haze. In one particularly bad episode, Summer had cried out mid-sleep, repeating a strange, melodic phrase over and over again. Linda, asleep in the cot beside her, recognized it instantly, not just the rhythm, but the exact wording. It was a lullaby, not a common one, but something Mark Halpern had made up during Summer's toddler years, a nonsensical tune he used to hum while bouncing her on his knee, words only their little family would know. Hide below, where the quiet monsters go. It was their private lullaby, born out of one rainy night when Summer was too scared to sleep. Linda hadn't heard those words in over 14 years. Hearing them now, murmured from the lips of a grown daughter who had lived most of her life in darkness, turned her stomach with equal parts heartbreak and horror. Summer couldn't remember singing it. When shown the words later, she blinked, confused, and shook her head. I just heard it somewhere, she said. Maybe in the dark. Maybe in my head. Linda knew what she had to do next, though it pained her. She needed to find Mark. Since Summer's disappearance and the collapse of their family, Mark Halpern had slipped from public record, his name appearing only in occasional VA correspondence or rural property transactions under shell ownership. After days of calling distant acquaintances and old military contacts, Linda traced him to a small, wooded cabin in eastern Washington, where he had been living off the grid for several years, working odd handyman jobs and spending most of his days fishing or maintaining the land. He didn't answer the first 2 calls, nor the voicemail Linda left. But on the 3rd try, he picked up. His voice was hoarse, wary, and quiet. "Linda," he said, and then silence. She told him everything about the discovery under the shed, the footage, the girl in the forest, and the DNA match. She told him Summer was alive. At first, he didn't believe her. She heard the disbelief melt into rage, then into a quiet, breathless weeping. He agreed to meet at the hospital. When he arrived, he looked like a shell of the man he had once been. His once proud frame had withered under the weight of guilt and solitude. He wore an old army field jacket, boots caked in dirt, and a beard flecked with gray. But when he saw Summer asleep under a thick blanket, her hair fanned across the pillow, he stopped cold. His knees buckled slightly. Linda caught him before he fell. They stood there for a long time, just looking. Later that night, after Summer had been sedated again following another dream episode, Mark sat in the hospital lounge and finally spoke. "I used to hear it," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "The knocking. It started months after she vanished." Linda listened, her hands folded tight. "I'd be in the living room, alone. It would come through the floorboards, 3 soft knocks. Always at night. Sometimes I'd hear it 2 or 3 times a week. I tore up part of the floor once. There was nothing, just earth, pipes. I thought," he stopped. "I thought it was the guilt, the meds, the nightmares from the war. I thought I was going crazy." Maya joined them then, notebook in hand. She asked him to describe the knocks again, their pattern, their timing. He did 3 short raps, evenly spaced, followed by silence. "It sounded like a child's fist," he said. "Small, hesitant, like she was scared to knock too loud." He looked at Maya. "And you're telling me she was beneath us all that time?" Maya nodded solemnly. The room was soundproofed with layers of insulation and wood, but if conditions were right, if the air was still enough, the house quiet enough, some sound could have carried. Mark dropped his head into his hands. "I thought I was crazy. I drank. I yelled at shadows. I should have listened." Summer's dreams worsened after her father's return, but something else began to change too. Her drawings evolved. She started sketching more vivid images, detailed renderings of the underground room, of the armoire, and of something else, a narrow crawl space hidden behind a wall panel, filled with tiny handprints in red wax. One drawing showed a staircase that led nowhere, terminating in blackness. And standing at the bottom, a girl in a red dress, eyes wide and lips sewn shut. When shown this image, Mark recoiled. "That's what I saw once," he said, pointing with a trembling finger. "In a dream. Or maybe not. It was a week after her disappearance. I was asleep in the den, and I woke up, saw her standing in the hallway. She looked like that, mouth closed, staring at me. I got up and followed her, but she vanished." Linda looked between them, realization dawning like a storm on the horizon. "We all saw pieces," she whispered. "Bits of her trying to reach us." The psychologist working with Summer suggested that trauma can fracture time within the mind, that isolated victims often develop patterns, songs, phrases, images, as anchors to preserve their sense of self. But Maya had a different theory. "Maybe," she said carefully, "she was trying to send messages." The idea seemed absurd, like something out of a horror novel, but the evidence was aligning. The knocking, the lullaby, the drawings, the nocturnal whisperings of the same repeated phrase, "Hide below, where the quiet monsters go." Then, one night, Summer asked a question that froze every drop of blood in Linda's veins. "Is he still there?" Linda leaned in gently. "Who, sweetheart?" Summer's eyes fluttered closed. "The man behind the red door." In the days following Mark's return and Summer's recurring dreams, the investigative team decided to revisit the old Halpern house one final time, this time with complete demolition clearance from the county. They started with the shed, now entirely gutted and exposed to sunlight for the first time in over a decade. Next, they turned their attention to the main house, which had remained vacant, hauntingly preserved like a time capsule of grief. It was Linda who suggested removing the armoire that Summer used to love, the one she had played in, the one that had seemed so harmless for so long. Maya agreed, hoping that perhaps the last remaining physical object tied to Summer's disappearance might still hold answers. When the crew tilted it forward, there was a moment of stillness, as if the air itself tightened. Behind it, on the faded wallpaper, was a message. Scrawled in waxy red lines, uneven and jagged, were the words, "Still here. Still waiting." The writing was low on the wall, about 2 feet from the floor, exactly the height of a 6-year-old child. It had been there the entire time, hidden behind furniture, overlooked, unseen. And now, 14 years later, it stared back at them like a wound that had never fully healed. Linda pressed her hand to her mouth. She didn't cry this time. She just stood there, breathing shallow, eyes wide, as if her entire body understood the weight of those 4 words. "She left it for us," Mark whispered. "A message. One last chance to be found." Maya took photographs, measurement samples, but there was nothing else behind the wall. No hollow space, no hatch. Just those words, etched into the paint like a child's final whisper. The message was archived, the armoire taken in for analysis, and by nightfall, the house was boarded up again. Everyone returned to their offices, homes, or in Linda's case, the hospital where Summer was beginning to smile again, just barely. That night, at 3 a.m., the same motion sensor camera left in the corner of the gutted shed activated. The footage, reviewed the next morning, showed nothing for the first few seconds. Then, faintly, so faintly that it barely registered on the audio feed, a sound emerged. A child's laugh, soft, distant, almost curious. Then silence. No wind, no insects, just that brief moment of laughter, followed by a single, almost imperceptible creak of wood. The most unnerving part wasn't the sound itself, but the timing. At precisely 3:02 a.m., that recording was made. And across town, at the exact same time, Summer Halpern was asleep in her hospital bed, under sedation, monitored by 2 nurses and a camera feed that showed no movement, no twitching, no sign of distress. She didn't laugh. She didn't speak. She was still. The medical log confirmed stable vitals throughout the night. Maya ran the comparison herself, double-checking the timestamps, the locations. The laugh on the shed camera didn't belong to Summer's present voice, at least not as it was now. But when compared to an old family video from Summer's 5th birthday, the pitch and tone matched exactly. It was as if something had echoed forward in time. Or maybe, Maya thought, something had been left behind. That same morning, Linda took Summer for a walk outside the hospital. The doctors agreed she needed sunlight, space, a place without white walls and monitoring devices. They walked slowly along the nearby nature path, birds chirping in the distance, the warmth of spring breaking through the last grip of winter. Summer wore a soft blue hoodie and held her mother's hand gently, as if still unsure of her surroundings. As they paused by a bench near the lake, Summer looked up suddenly and asked, "Can we go home now?" Linda froze. "You mean the house?" Summer shook her head. "No, not the old one. A new one. One with windows." Linda smiled through tears. "Yes, baby. A house with big windows." Summer didn't say anything more. She just nodded, then looked toward the trees and whispered, "Tell him I'm not waiting anymore." Linda didn't ask who. She just pulled her daughter close. Back at the station, Maya closed the last file on the Halpern case. It wasn't complete. There were no criminal charges left to file, no living suspect to prosecute. But there was resolution. A girl had returned. A mother had found her. A father had forgiven himself. The house would be torn down completely in the coming weeks, replaced by a memorial garden funded by anonymous donors. At the edge of the property, where the shed once stood, a wooden sign was placed. Carved into it, with delicate hands and soft curves, were the same words that had once been scrawled in crayon behind a forgotten armoire. Still here. Still waiting. But someone, perhaps Maya, perhaps Linda, had crossed out the word waiting and etched in something new. Still here. Still loved. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more mysterious and emotional journeys like this one. We'd love to know, what part of Summer's story surprised you the most? And where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it.